Francisco d'Ancona.
Watching, we know you.
Assalamu alaikum, welcome to Face to Face with me, Azad Ali. This week we're talking about Algeria, and again I'm blessed to have Jahangir Mohammed in the studio. Assalamu alaikum, Jahangir.
Wa alaikum salam.
Jahangir is a director for Centre for Muslim Affairs and also a geopolitical commentator. So, Jahangir, we're going to talk about these protests that have been taking place for the last few weeks in Algeria, and it's actually drawn huge crowds. And it's to do with the current president, who's been the president of Algeria for the last 20 years, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, saying that he wants to run for a fifth term. Now, he's had a major stroke in 2013. He's wheelchair bound, and a lot of people are wondering if he's even fit for office. But he doesn't seem to want to give up. Recently, he's just a few. I think yesterday he announced that he's still going to run, but he's made a semi-compromise. He's saying that if I do win again, then what I'll do is I'll call a national assembly and kind of get somebody else in. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I think Algeria is a very interesting situation, which most people tend to have forgotten about since the 90s. And it's interesting that there wasn't any mass protest during the so-called Arab Spring in Algeria, and yet you're now seeing those protests. And although it's about the president and the fact that he's not going and he's been there for 20 years, underlying it is a deep satisfaction with the way the country is being run and the economy. Huge youth unemployment, economic situation is bad, poverty, and it's quite fascinating really to see how this sparked up, partly because people are sharing their experiences on social media and whatever.
But it has all the hallmarks of what we saw during the Arab Spring, if you like. There is a huge social media kind of use of mobilizing people, if you like. But just to remind some our viewers, in 1999, when he did take over, this was following a coup that took power away from the democratically elected Islamic Party that did come into power. But since then, the country basically was in civil war, if you like, and to the tune of some quoting, 200,000 Algerians were killed during that time. Do you think, people have recovered for that, or is this like a continuation of like looking for their freedoms?
Yeah, I think it's important for the viewers to remember that Algeria was a French colony, and since 1962 there's sort of been socialist and military French-backed rule in there until, and at one point political parties were banned until the 90s. And that's when the Islamic Salvation Front was formed, FIS as it was known, and in 1991 they basically swept the first round of elections with 188 seats, and the second round of the elections was due to take place in 1992, and basically the French, using the military in Algeria, basically aborted the process and took control. And then followed a very interesting scenario which people have not actually looked at properly. This is where the ISIS strategy actually started. So what happened was, to destroy the Islamic movement, in 1992, a group which genuinely existed within Algeria called the Armed Islamic Army, or GIA. Yeah, that became active because the democratic process had been aborted. But what happened was, and this wasn't clear at the time, but subsequently books have been written on it, ex-military officers have told us what happened. The Algerians, with French backing, the Algerian junta, basically created a monster. And that monster started killing their own people, massacring villages, capturing monks, and in one particular case, the Belhatra village, 400 people were slaughtered, and as you say, 200,000 people were killed. But we now know, and there's been books written on this, and military officers, like The Dirty War. I remember at the time a prominent French writer telling me, actually, this is what's happening. Similar to Assad, and this is my belief, that this monster called ISIS, although there has been a genuine group called the Islamic State for Iraq and Sham, when it's got to Syria, a monster's been created, and that monster was in Algeria was to delegitimize the Islamic movement. So what you had was a period where any kind of Islamic political movement was basically quashed. And so since '99, really, when Bouteflika has come in, effectively there's been no Islamic type movement or opposition. People have been put off Islam, Islamic parties, because of that.
I mean, I've been speaking to some Algerians as well about this, and one of the things they tell me, especially when the Arab Spring did take place, like in neighbouring Libya and Tunisia, is that a lot of Algerians, they were just scared of what took place in the 90s, and they didn't want the bloodshed that would come. They can see that there's going to be huge bloodshed, and they just were afraid to
yeah, I mean, it was crushed militarily. It was crushed, and the military were involved in those atrocities, but also there was a fight back. So militarily it was quashed, and then politically any kind of Islamic movement was quashed, and a lot of Algerians who were Islamically minded ended up in other parts of the world fighting in battles, and and it's interesting that some of the most I think the most numbers of fighters in ISIS tend to be from Algeria and the North African state. So you then had a situation where really the Algerians accepted that situation, and you had Bouteflika. The economy improved for a period, so everything was calm.
That's one of the comments some people have made, that during the Arab Spring, what the President Bouteflika did really well was that he increased distribution of wealth to the Algerians, and because the oil prices and everything was that high, and the economy was doing well. But one of the things that I've seen on the protests, whilst the protest is about him not taking, seeking re-election, what a lot of people that are on the protest, what they're saying is it's not just about him, it's about the system. That they feel like they're stranglehold on their freedom. They can't speak, they're not getting their freedoms. And Algeria being one of the countries that has a huge youth population, I think I read a stat somewhere that said like almost 70% of Algerians are 30 and under. And the unemployment rate is quite high as well amongst young people. So it seems like this is not a Islamically driven thing or Islam-based kind of protest. It's actually pure and simple to do with economics.
Yeah, it seems like that, but I think there is also the whole. You've got to remember that Bouteflika is a face, and behind him is the military junta in Algeria, and behind them are the French and the Europeans who've been backing that. So that obviously people have not been allowed to express their politics and their Islamic way of life. So there's been resistance to that. So that hasn't come about, but maybe I think behind some of the protests which are to do with economics, I think we're now beginning to see another stirring of a political movement.
I mean, the protests that they're taking place all over.
And they're massive.
Massive, yeah. And then, I mean, the one in Algiers, was it last Friday? Yeah, after Jummah last Friday. It was huge. It just reminded me of Egypt, Tahrir Square and things like that. And also, but it's taking place in Paris and other places. So do you think there is a, like with the Algerian people, there is a kind of consensus that actually, you know what, this is an opportunity for us to...
Yeah, I think people want change. They want to see a change of face. I think we can compare it to Turkey. You know, for years we had the military junta, and then you had some Islamic parties, and then eventually people sort of moved in that direction. They wanted change, and I think that's what's happening. People don't want this old system of a politician who's very much the military choice to be there. They want to see somebody fresh, somebody young, who perhaps will relax all these restrictions, and as well as change the economy and get still behind the scenes, get rid of the French influence.
I mean, that's what one of the commentators did actually mention, that there is this the French kind of hold on Algeria hasn't gone at all.
Yeah, and the French hold on Africa is still there. They're involved in Mali, they're involved in all these other countries, and we have to remember that the French were the most harshest of colonists. It was a cultural colonialism. People weren't allowed to express their religion, their language was changed. It wasn't like the British experiment. People were forced to dress in Western ways. It was very extreme.
It's quite brutalizing.
It's quite, and 1 million people died in the War of Independence. They slaughtered 1 million Algerians.
So a lot of history to come
There's
back.
a lot of history.
Yeah.
And,
okay, so we're just gonna we're coming up to a break, so we'll take a short break, but inshallah we will continue this after the break. So stay tuned, inshallah. Join us after the break. Welcome back to Face to Face with me, Azad Ali. So just before the break, Jahangir, we were just talking about, you know, the colonial effect on Algeria and also Africa from the French and everything else, and how brutalizing it was, and, you know, to the point where their culture and religion was like forcibly kind of challenged and changed in places. So coming back from all of this, I mean, one of the questions that do come up in a lot of people's minds is, you know, trying to bring about an Islamic kind of solution. What I mean by that is maybe some people will call it a khilafah or something, but a governance system that actually puts Islam and the interests of Islam and Muslims first, rather than a secular approach or a capitalist approach. That seems to be something that is, like, you know, impossible to achieve, and where it is achieved democratically, in the case of Egypt, you know, the kind of army comes in and does a coup d'etat with the backing of Western nations, and it's back to square one.
Yeah, I think what's happened is a number of things have happened in the Muslim world which have led to the West seeing the possibility of change and taking steps to stop it happening. So you had the revolution in 1979 in Iran, which caught everybody off guard. And Algeria was destined to be the next one, except they went for a democratic route rather than a people's revolution. And they'd learnt, I think the Western powers and the French had learnt from the first one, that they weren't going to allow this change to happen. So they stopped the process, and you know, in the Arab Spring, although they basically were openly supporting the change, what we see during the Arab Spring is the old order is back in every one of those countries. So behind the scenes, they actually didn't want a change to the old order. I
mean, this brings two questions to my mind. One is, has it been worth it? Like, all the effort, the lives lost, and the costs during the Arab Spring, whether it's in Egypt or Tunisia or other places. Libya, I mean, is probably one of the best examples of a functioning country, regardless of the leader and all of the issues with that. But it was a functioning country, to actually almost like a lawless country at the moment.
Yeah, well, it's not exactly lawless. I think what it is, Tripoli in the centre is controlled by the West and the UN, and that's where the power and the resources are controlled by the West. So I think what happened was the change happened, but then the West has come in, Western powers backed various factions, and this tends to happen. So this is a process that's going to happen. So Syria and Libya, the two countries where there was a much greater chance of a revolutionary change, as opposed to Egypt and other Tunisia. And in those two countries, the West has got involved, Iran has got involved, and they basically thwarted that process. This happens, unfortunately. This is part of history. It happened in European history. You've had civil wars. Ultimately, these are all part of the change process. It might be painful, but
so this is like part of the process.
This is part of the process, and there's a learning phase. So movements learn, the different political groups, the militias learn, and eventually, small changes lead to big changes. So what you're seeing in Algeria is a product of what happened in the past, and eventually something will emerge.
I mean, since the early 90s, if you like, what's taken place in Algeria is very brave, because nothing like this to this scale has happened since then. And so do you think, and it is mainly led by young people, I mean, majority of the people that are out there, there are obviously others there, but majority you're looking at average age of 25 or 30. Do you think that, I don't want to use the term Arab Spring, but do you think they're on the cusp of a revolution perhaps?
Well, I think, for revolutions to happen, you have to also have, I think what's happening here and what happened in the Arab Spring is, I said 2-3 years before the Arab Spring on various radio programs that I see great change happening, and I could see a revolutionary process taking place. What's happened is the people are ahead of their movements and their political groupings. So the political groups in Egypt, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood weren't ready for a revolution. It was the young people on the streets. And basically they went back to the old system rather looking for a change. And that's exactly what's happening, whether it's Kashmir or in Algeria. You see younger people who, in terms of their desire for change, in terms of their methodology for change, are more revolutionary and want that change, yet the politics of the Muslim world, the Islamic movements, Islamic parties, are not ready for that change. And I think there's going to be
there's a gap between the two.
And the leadership hasn't emerged, which can actually take the masses to the next step. So, but eventually it will happen.
Do you think, in terms of models to use, like, we've said this a few times, there needs to be learning and everything else. Are there any models that you can think of like that where the learning can be useful for people to take from?
Well, I think it depends on the context. So, for example, the only successful model we've had of a revolution that's got rid of a despot is in Iran. But unfortunately they're Shia, and people don't see that, even though the Muslim Brotherhood had close relations with Iran.
I get they're Shia, but still the model is
there.
Is useful.
And in other places you've had the Taliban and others through jihad, and these are the two main methodologies.
What about what the Turkish people did? That was more like through a democratic process,
and that's going to take a much longer time.
But it does seem more stable.
It does for the time being, but whether that will eventually, as you saw, there was an attempted coup. So whether that there will be an attempt to abort that process.
I think this
so
is
only there's going to be a different types of
the question
approaches.
I wanted to ask is how do people, say for example the Algerians, we're talking about Algeria, how do they carry out their will, their kind of desire for change without seeking help from outsiders? Because it seems to me as soon as you get help from whoever it is, whether it's Russia or America or UK or France, they're going to have their vested interests.
Yeah.
And then you're tied to that.
But I think the Algerians actually had one. They just chose the wrong mechanism. Instead of looking at a revolutionary change, they went for a democratic change, not realizing that the old system was still there. The same's happened in Egypt. So the Algerians actually had done what the Iranians had done, except they didn't go all the way.
Yeah.
And
but
to
maybe
force them,
it wasn't
and
in their
force the military.
capacity.
The leadership hadn't thought through the process, and the military, unfortunately, we didn't find a way of persuading the military in all these regimes, maybe because the scholars hadn't given pronouncements to say, look, these are your people, don't shoot them, you can't do this.
I mean, it's shocking that you need someone to tell you that, but I think...
And that's the difference with Iran. You had people, and obviously you had women who were pleading with the soldiers not to kill people.
I think you had some of that in Egypt as well.
You had some of that in Egypt, but ultimately in Egypt the mistake that was made was that they went back to the old military ruler and system, which they had done in the 60s as well. So the same mistake was repeated.
It just feels like they're not thinking out of the box. So I mean, just we're nearing the end. I mean, in terms of these protests, where do you think they're going to go to? What's going to be the end game?
Well, it depends on. I mean, we're not sure yet about the forces behind them and the politics behind them, or whether this is again the same situation as you had in Egypt, where the young people are way ahead. I mean, in Egypt, you did have some political movement and political organisation. It's been destroyed in Algeria, but whether there's actually been something happening behind the scenes, underground, only time will tell. And it may get bigger, it may lead to change, and it's whether people want to go beyond just changing the face.
Do you think they will get the same interference from other countries?
Undoubtedly. I think the global world order and the West don't want things to change, and sadly the existing rulers in the Muslim world don't want things to change.
I mean, this is, just before we do end, I mean, this is an interesting point that you kind of mentioned. There seems to be, I mean, we have these nation states, but it seems to be every one of those states has a vested interest to remain in power that was left to it by its colonial kind of history.
Yeah, I think Malcolm X summed it up brilliantly, and Algeria is the perfect example. When the old colonial rulers left, they didn't just leave, they passed the ball to one of their own. And what you had under colonialism was a elite, whether it's Pakistan or other countries, which were Muslim and Pakistani or Algerian, but essentially they were French or they were British in their mindset. And Imran Khan actually in Pakistan talks about this. He said, look, we learnt more about Western history in these schools than our own. So you have an elite which is essentially a byproduct, a leftover, and those people have ruled the Islamic world. We haven't got an educated...
We've not come out of that.
No, and these colonialists destroyed the Islamic education system. And to put that, to force that change, we have to reproduce the Islamic education
Jazakallah khair. I'm sorry I had to stop you. It's actually getting more interesting, and inshallah we will have you on again. Sorry viewers, we have run out of time. Do join me again next week for another episode of Face to Face. Take care. Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair.